My name is Helen. The moment I saw that photo, everything inside me shattered like glass, cracking slowly, sharp, and unforgiving. There I was, caught mid-mop, bending over the kitchen floor, back-arched hair falling forward like a curtain hiding my face. The caption underneath, a laughing emoji tagged with my daughter Lindsay's name. It was public. Anyone could see it. Anyone could laugh. Trust me, you'll regret skipping this story. So before you sit back and listen, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Grace's Truth. Now get in the mood to listen to this story, because it might be the ultimate sweet revenge. I stared at the screen, the kitchen behind me in disarray, the floor half cleaned. I could feel the weight of every mocking glance this photo would bring, the ripple of humiliation spreading faster than any broom could sweep away dust. Lindsay posted it during one of her typical weekend get-togethers, a chance to show off her perfect life: brunches in sunlit cafes, parties with stylish friends, sharp heels clicking on marble floors. And there I was, a punchline. It wasn't the photo itself that broke me. It was the way she smiled in it, the way her laughter echoed behind the screen, like a whip cracking on my skin. I wanted to call her, scream, ask how she could be so cruel, but I didn't. Instead, I swallowed the lump in my throat and turned the phone off. The silence afterward was suffocating. That night, I sat alone in the dark, the hum of the city leaking in through the cracked window. I wondered how many times I had been invisible to her before this moment. How many times I'd bent over backwards for her only to be reduced to a joke. I remembered the nights I stayed up worrying, the mornings I woke early to make breakfast, the countless sacrifices no one ever saw or thanked me for. And now this. I wasn't just hurt, I was erased. But somewhere beneath the pain, a quiet fire began to grow. This wasn't just about a picture. It was about respect. It was about love. And it was about the truth I was finally ready to tell. I put my phone down and stared at the photo again, letting the humiliation wash over me. I tried to remember the last time Lindsay and I really talked. Not just small talk, not just polite check-ins, but honest conversations where I felt seen as her mother, not a background character in her glamorous life. The truth hit me hard. We hadn't had one of those in years. She was always so busy with her job, her friends, her new life. And I was always just there. The mom who cleaned the house, made the meals, kept the wheels turning while she soared ahead. Maybe that's why she thought it was funny to post that picture. Maybe she thought it was just another harmless joke. But it wasn't harmless to me. That photo wasn't just a snapshot. It was a public humiliation wrapped in pixels. A reminder that the woman who once held her hand through scraped knees and heartbreaks was now the punchline for her online followers. I closed my eyes and remembered the early mornings, the breakfast trays I carried in when she was sick. The countless times I stayed up waiting for her to come home safe. The quiet prayers whispered in the night for her happiness. And now she shared my lowest moment with the world like it was a meme. My hands clenched into fists. A storm brewed inside me, a mix of sadness, anger, and something else. Something sharp. Resolve. I wasn't going to let this break me. Not today. Not ever. I knew I had to respond, but not with screams or tears. I needed a calm strength, something Lindsay hadn't seen in years. The next morning, I brewed a fresh pot of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, the light filtering through the window like a spotlight. I wrote Lindsay a message, but not a pleading apology or a bitter rebuke. Instead, I wrote a quiet truth. Lindsay, I saw the picture. You made me the joke of your feed. Maybe you thought it was funny. Maybe you wanted attention. But what you don't see is what I gave you: everything I had, everything I am. I'm more than a bent back and a mop. I'm the woman who built this home, who carried you through storms you never saw. If you want to know what that really means, maybe we need to talk. I hit send. And then I waited. Days passed without a reply. The silence was deafening, but it was mine now. Mine to own, mine to shape. I began to reclaim my identity piece by piece. No longer just mom. No longer just that picture. I was Helen, a woman who deserved respect, love, and dignity. And I was ready to show Lindsay and the world exactly that. The days after I sent that message stretched out like a long, empty road. I checked my phone a dozen times a day, hoping for a reply from Lindsay. But the silence only deepened. Instead of sinking into despair, I decided to focus on myself. For the first time in years, I booked an appointment with a counselor. I told her about the photo, about the ache it left in my chest, about feeling invisible in my own family. "It's not just about the picture," I said quietly. "It's about feeling like I'm not enough, like all I do is taken for granted." She nodded, her eyes gentle but knowing. "Sometimes the people closest to us hurt the most. But your value isn't defined by their recognition." Those words echoed in my mind long after the session ended. I realized I'd been holding my worth hostage, tied to Lindsay's approval, and that chain was heavy, too heavy to carry any longer. I began writing again, something I hadn't done in years. Not letters or emails, but stories, little vignettes from my life, memories of joy and sorrow, triumph and heartbreak. Writing helped me see myself outside the lens of motherhood as a woman who had lived, loved, lost, and survived. One afternoon, while I was at the park feeding the birds, my phone buzzed. A message. From Lindsay. It was short. "I'm sorry." No explanations, no excuses, just those two simple words. My throat tightened. A part of me wanted to shout, to demand more, to know why she did it, why she chose humiliation over respect. But another part just wanted to breathe, to feel the weight lift just a little. I replied, "Thank you for saying that." And in that small exchange, something fragile began to mend. I wasn't sure what the future held, if Lindsay and I would ever truly heal. But I knew one thing for sure. I was reclaiming my story. One word, one day, one quiet moment at a time. The next days were quieter but heavier. Lindsay's simple apology lingered like a whisper in a silent room, fragile and tentative. I found myself staring at my phone more often than I cared to admit, wondering if she'd say more, or if this was the end of the conversation. But it was enough for now. Enough to crack open the door a little so light could seep through. I started spending more time at the bookstore where I worked. The routine of organizing books, helping customers, and getting lost in stories reminded me of who I was beyond the roles I'd been given. One afternoon, the owner, Ms. Thompson, asked if I wanted to help organize a community reading event. I hesitated. Part of me doubted I still had anything meaningful to offer outside my family drama. But she smiled warmly. "You've got a way with people and stories. You should share yours." Her words stirred something inside me, a quiet spark I hadn't felt in years. That night, I sat down with my notebook and started writing about the photo, the shame, the hurt, the unexpected liberation. I poured every raw emotion onto the page. Writing felt like breathing again. A few weeks later, I found myself reading my story aloud at the bookstore event. The room was small, the crowd modest, but their eyes were full of empathy. When I finished, a woman approached me. "Your story, it touched me." I've felt invisible too. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't just a mother scorned. I was a woman whose pain resonated, whose voice mattered. Meanwhile, Lindsay's posts online continued, but I no longer felt the sting. I had unfollowed her months ago and discovered a strange freedom in letting go of the screen's sharp edges. I still hoped for more. A real conversation, maybe even reconciliation, but I wasn't waiting anymore. I was living. One morning, as I sipped coffee on Marianne's patio, I realized something. My worth was no longer tangled up in Lindsay's approval or disdain. I was enough. The days after Lindsay posted that picture of me bending over to mop the floor felt like living inside a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I wasn't sure what stung more, the image itself frozen in time, or the way she had twisted it into a cruel joke for everyone to see. But it wasn't just the humiliation that cut deepest. It was the realization that my daughter, the one I had given everything to, had so little respect for me. I tried to tell myself it was just a phase, a reckless mistake in the heat of youth. But every notification, every message felt like salt, rubbed into a wound that refused to heal. Even my friends, the ones I'd counted on, whispered behind their hands. Some tried to comfort me. Others dropped away, uncomfortable with the drama. I was left to carry the weight alone, folding laundry in the quiet moments, the stench of bleach in the air mingling with the sour taste of betrayal. At night, I would lie awake staring at the ceiling, replaying Lindsay's laugh, sharp, careless, like a blade sliding across my ribs. How had things gone so wrong? How did a mother who had bent over backwards for her daughter become a subject of mockery? I felt hollowed out but angry too. Not just at Lindsay, but at myself for letting this happen. The more I tried to pull myself together, the more I realized how much I had lost in the process of being mom. My own dreams, my own needs. They'd all been buried under decades of sacrifice. I'd become invisible to the very person who was supposed to love me unconditionally. One afternoon, I sat on the porch with a cup of lukewarm tea, the sun dipping low behind the trees, casting long shadows across the yard. The air smelled of dry earth and summer grass. It should have been peaceful, but inside a storm raged. That's when Marianne, my neighbor, came out with a kind smile and a basket of freshly baked cookies. "I thought you could use a break," she said softly. I wanted to tell her everything, the humiliation, the pain, the loneliness. But instead I just nodded and accepted the cookies. Over the next few days, Marianne became my anchor. She didn't pry or ask questions. She just showed up with coffee, a warm blanket, and quiet company. We sat on her little patio, sometimes speaking, sometimes just sharing the silence. It was strange how comfort could come without words. One morning, while I was dusting at the bookstore where I'd recently started working Mrs. Ellen, the owner, paused and looked at me with something like admiration. "You have a way with the shelves," she said quietly. "Like you understand the stories these books want to tell." It was the first genuine compliment I'd received in months, and it felt like a lifeline. Working there gave me a small sense of purpose outside the chaos of my fractured family. Each day I lost myself in the scent of paper and the gentle hum of quiet customers. The rhythm of organizing books became a kind of meditation, a way to steady the storm inside. But no matter how busy I was, Lindsay's absence, her coldness clung to me like a shadow. She continued posting pictures of her glamorous life brunches with friends, rooftop parties, smiling faces at her office holiday party. Not once did she reach out. Not even on Christmas when the ache of loneliness was sharpest. One evening, Marianne caught me folding laundry in a way I hadn't done in years, with no one around but myself. "You okay?" she asked, her voice gentle but probing. I hesitated before answering. "I think I'm finally grieving," I said quietly. "For her?" Marianne asked. "No," I replied, folding the last towel carefully. "For the version of me who thought being needed was the same as being loved." Her eyes held mine for a long moment, as if she understood the weight behind those words better than I could say. That night, lying in my small rented room, something inside me shifted. It wasn't sudden or dramatic. No lightning bolts or revelations. Just a quiet, stubborn clarity. I had spent so many years being mom. The one who cleaned, who cooked, who was always there to catch the tears or smooth the hurt. But now, in this lonely space, folding warm towels that no one would use for a long time, I had to ask myself, who was I if I wasn't defined by my daughter's approval? Who was I when the weight of her betrayal was no longer pressing on my shoulders? For the first time in decades, I felt the fragile stirrings of freedom. The next morning, I opened my Facebook account dormant for months and found Lindsay's profile. I stared at it, feeling no anger or bitterness, only exhaustion. Slowly, carefully, I clicked unfollow. It wasn't spite. It wasn't even a statement. It was simply a choice to stop watching a version of my daughter that hurt me to witness. Days later, something unexpected happened. A plain envelope appeared in my mailbox. No return address. Just my name written in familiar handwriting. Inside a folded note. "You were right about the post. I'm sorry. I didn't think. I was showing off. I was stupid." Signed simply, L. There was no plea to come home. No flowers. No invitation to talk. Just a folded piece of paper carrying the weight of regret. I placed the note carefully into a small box with old family photos, reminders of a time before pain. Not to forgive and forget, but to mark a shift. Sometimes the apology we want never comes. Sometimes the apology we need arrives in the smallest package. And sometimes we learn to give ourselves the closure others can't or won't offer. That night, as the moon cast a silver glow through my window, I felt a quiet peace settle over me. It wasn't a happy ending, no fairy tale with perfect reconciliations, but it was a beginning, my beginning. The note sat on my bedside table folded so neatly it almost looked like a small gift. For days I stared at it, but didn't open it. It felt too fragile, like cracking open an old photograph that might crumble the moment I touched it. When I finally unfolded the paper, the words were short, but they carried a weight that settled deep in my chest. You were right about the post. I'm sorry. I didn't think. I was showing off. I was stupid. L. No flowery apologies, no promises, no excuses. Just honesty. A simple acknowledgement that she had crossed a line. I read the note over and over, tracing each word with my eyes as if trying to find a hidden meaning behind the plain letters. Was this the start of something? Or was it just a flicker of guilt that would soon burn out? For the first time in months, I allowed myself to hope. Not for reconciliation, not for a miracle, but for a sliver of understanding. But understanding didn't come overnight. The days that followed were filled with silence. Lindsay said nothing more. She didn't call. She didn't text. It was as if the note was her only bridge across the gulf she had created between us. The silence was deafening. I wrestled with it every day. I wanted to call her to beg her to explain why she had done what she did, why she had chosen to humiliate me publicly instead of coming to me directly. But something held me back. Pride, fear, or maybe just the exhaustion of fighting a battle that felt endless. Instead, I turned inward. I started to take long walks early in the morning before the world had fully woken up. The neighborhood was quiet, bathed in the soft golden light of dawn. The air was crisp with the faint scent of jasmine and freshly cut grass. I would walk for miles sometimes without a destination, sometimes circling the same blocks, feeling the steady rhythm of my footsteps grounding me. Those walks became my sanctuary. I thought a lot during those hours about my life, about Lindsay, about the years we had shared, and the chasms that had grown between us. I thought about the sacrifices I had made, the nights I spent awake, worrying the meals I prepared, the countless times I hid my own pain to make sure she never saw it. But I also began to see things differently. I began to realize that love doesn't mean you have to lose yourself in someone else's shadow. That sometimes the hardest thing to do is to let go, not of them, but of the expectations and the hurt they've piled onto you. I wasn't just mom anymore. I was a woman with dreams and flaws and a life that didn't have to revolve around her daughter's approval. One afternoon at the bookstore, Mrs. Ellen pulled me aside while I was stacking a new shipment of novels. "You seem different these days," she said, her eyes bright and knowing. "There's a kind of fire in your eyes now. Not the kind that burns you up, but the kind that lights your way." I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through me. It was true, I felt different, stronger, more alive. With each shift, I found small moments of peace. A kind word from a customer, the scent of old paper and ink, the quiet hum of the cash register. For the first time in a long while, I was creating a space where I belonged on my own terms. At home, I started to reclaim small joys I had forgotten. I dug out an old box of paints and brushes from the attic and set up a little corner in my new apartment where I could lose myself in color and canvas. Painting became a kind of therapy, each stroke a release, each shade a confession. One evening, after a particularly long day, I pulled out the box of old family photos I had taken with me. Among the faded pictures, I found one of Lindsay and me taken years ago when she was still a little girl with wide eyes and a heart full of trust. In the photo, she was laughing and I was smiling, genuine, open, and unguarded. I held the photo in my hands and let the tears come. Not tears of sadness, but of mourning. Mourning the loss of that innocence, that bond we once had, and the mother I thought I was. But there was no bitterness in my tears, just a quiet acceptance. I realized then that this was the moment I needed to heal, not just from Lindsay's betrayal, but from all the years I had lived, trying to fit into a mold I thought was love. Slowly, I reached a decision. I sent Lindsay a message, short, simple, and honest. "I received your note. Thank you. I'm ready to talk when you are." Then I waited. Hours stretched into a day, then 2, then 3, still no reply. At first the silence stung, But I reminded myself this wasn't about rushing her or fixing everything overnight. This was about giving us both the space to find our way back, or at least to start that journey. Meanwhile, life around me kept moving. I found myself talking to Marianne, more leaning on her quiet support and steady presence. She never pushed me to talk about Lindsay, but always offered a listening ear when I needed it. One afternoon over coffee on her patio, she said something that stuck with me. You know, sometimes the people who hurt us the most are just as lost as we are. Her words opened a door I hadn't dared to open before. Maybe Lindsay wasn't the villain in my story. Maybe she was a frightened woman struggling under her own weight of expectations and mistakes. Maybe forgiveness wasn't about excusing her behavior, but understanding her pain and mine. I'm still not sure what the future holds between us, whether we'll ever fully bridge the gap that's grown so wide. But I know this: I am no longer defined by her judgment or her cruelty. I am learning to love myself again. And that in the end might be the greatest victory of all. The days after I sent Lindsay that message were some of the hardest I'd faced. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart would leap only to crash when it wasn't her. The silence felt like a wall pressing in thicker and colder with each passing hour. But I refused to let the emptiness swallow me whole. Instead, I found myself diving deeper into my work at the bookstore. Mrs. Ellen had become more than just an employer. She was a lifeline. Her quiet confidence and sharp wit gave me something to hold on to. Sometimes during slow afternoons, she'd glance at me with those piercing eyes and say, "You're stronger than you think." I didn't always believe her, but I appreciated that she saw me not just as a worker stacking shelves, but as a person reclaiming her life. One evening, as I closed up the shop, Mrs. Ellen surprised me by asking if I'd like to organize a small book reading event. The idea was to gather a handful of local readers and share stories in the cozy back room. I hesitated at first. Public speaking wasn't my forte, but something inside me craved connection beyond the sterile silences at home. "I'll do it," I said finally. The event was set for 2 weeks later. Between shifts, I found myself preparing a mix of excitement and nervousness buzzing in my veins. I chose a few of my favorite poems and short stories, pieces that spoke of pain, resilience, and quiet hope. The night of the reading arrived, and I stood before a small circle of attentive faces, feeling exposed, yet alive. When I read aloud the words of a woman who had learned to find strength in loss, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't known for a long time: acceptance. After the event, a few people came up to thank me, telling me their own stories of hardship and healing. Their voices, raw and honest, wrapped around me like a warm embrace. For the first time in months, I realized I wasn't alone in this journey. At home that night, I sat by the window watching the city lights flicker like distant stars. My phone lay beside me, silent. I thought about Lindsay, about the daughter I had raised, the woman she was becoming, and the vast gulf between us. Was she struggling too? Did she feel the weight of what she had done? I didn't know. And maybe for now, I didn't need to. What I did know was that I was starting to find peace within myself. I was learning to breathe without the constant need for her approval, to fill my days with purpose that wasn't tied to anyone else's happiness. The next morning, I received a surprise call from Marianne. "I have something for you," she said mysteriously. When I arrived at her house, she handed me a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a delicate journal, its pages blank and inviting. "Start writing," she encouraged gently. "Write down your thoughts, your fears, your dreams. Sometimes putting it all on paper helps us make sense of the mess inside." I nodded, feeling a lump in my throat. For years, I had buried my emotions under layers of duty and silence. Maybe it was time to let them out. That night, I opened the journal and began to write. At first, the words came haltingly, fragments of pain and confusion. But as the pages filled, I felt the tight knot inside me begin to loosen. Writing became a ritual, a way to confront the shadows lurking in my heart. One entry stood out. "I am more than a mother who was mocked. I am a woman who survived. I am learning to love the parts of myself I once hid." As the weeks passed, I noticed subtle changes. My shoulders relaxed. My steps grew lighter. I smiled more, not because everything was perfect, but because I was finally finding a path forward. And then one quiet afternoon, my phone lit up with a message from Lindsay. It was brief. "Can we meet?" My heart pounded as I stared at the screen. This was the moment I had both dreaded and hoped for. I wanted to respond immediately to pour out everything I'd felt, everything I'd learned. But I hesitated, remembering the fragile distance we still needed to navigate. After a deep breath, I typed back, "Yes, let's talk." The meeting place she suggested was a small cafe near the park neutral ground. When I arrived, I spotted her sitting at a corner table, her eyes tired but soft. She stood as I approached, and for a moment we just looked at each other, two women carrying years of hurt and hope. We talked for hours, not about blame or anger, but about the pain we'd both felt. Lindsay apologized again, this time with tears. I shared my journey of finding strength outside her shadow. It wasn't perfect. There were silences heavy with unspoken memories, but there was also a tentative thread of healing weaving between us. Walking home that evening, I realized something profound. Forgiveness wasn't about forgetting or excusing. It was about choosing to see each other as flawed, hurting people trying their best. And maybe that was enough to start rebuilding. The cafe smelled of fresh coffee and baked pastries, a comforting hum of quiet conversations and clinking cups wrapping around us like a fragile bubble. Lindsay and I sat across from each other at that small corner table, the sunlight filtering through the window casting a soft glow over her face. A face I once knew so well, now marked by the weight of distance and regret. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was heavy, but somehow necessary, a space where all the unsaid words, the bruised feelings, and the years of misunderstanding hung in the air between us. I watched her fingers nervously play with the edge of her coffee cup, trying to find the right words. Finally, Lindsay looked up and said, voice barely above a whisper, "Mom, I'm sorry. I know I hurt you." The photo, the caption, it was cruel. I wasn't thinking. I wanted to show off to make people laugh, but I didn't realize how much it would cut you. I guess. I guess I just felt lost, and maybe I thought if I pushed you away I'd be free. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, and for a moment the angry daughter who mocked me was gone. What remained was a frightened young woman, my daughter struggling with her own pain, trapped in a storm I had never fully seen. I reached across the table and took her hand gently. "Lindsay, I won't lie, it hurt. But I've been hurt in ways you might not understand yet. I've lived my whole life trying to be the perfect mother, the provider, the safe place. And somewhere along the way, I forgot to be me." She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks now. "I didn't realize how much pressure I put on you or on myself. I wanted to be perfect, to live up to expectations. But instead, I pushed you away." We talked for hours, peeling back layers of resentment, misunderstandings, and pain. I told her about the years I spent feeling invisible, about the nights I cried alone after she left the house, about the mornings I dragged myself out of bed, wondering if I was enough. Lindsay listened, really listened, and I could see the walls around her heart starting to crumble. It wasn't a miracle cure, not by any stretch, but it was a start. When we finally left the cafe, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. We walked side by side through the park, the soft crunch of leaves beneath our feet, echoing the tentative steps we were taking toward healing. That night, I lay awake thinking about how fragile relationships are, how easily love can be twisted into pain when we stop listening to each other. But I also thought about hope. The kind of hope that doesn't promise a perfect ending but offers the courage to keep trying. The next few weeks were a mix of progress and setbacks. Lindsay and I exchanged texts more often, sometimes just small messages, checking in other times, long conversations about our feelings and fears. We met occasionally for coffee or lunch, each meeting less awkward than the last. Still, there were moments when old wounds flared, a harsh word here, a misunderstood comment there. But instead of retreating into silence, we started to talk through the pain. It was messy and exhausting, but real. One afternoon, Lindsay called me in tears. She had lost her job, and the weight of failure felt unbearable. Without hesitation, I dropped everything and drove to her apartment. Seeing her vulnerability the way she crumpled into my arms reminded me how much we both needed each other, even if we didn't always show it. Together, we made plans for her next steps. I helped her update her resume, reached out to contacts, and even sat with her through some job interviews. Watching her determination to rebuild her life gave me strength I didn't know I still had. At the same time, I was rediscovering myself. My part-time job at the bookstore had become more than just a paycheck. It was a sanctuary where I found joy in the simple act of organizing stories, connecting with customers, and being seen as more than just mom. Mrs. Ellen invited me to lead a weekly book club, and I found myself thriving in this new role. Sharing stories with others reminded me that every person carries their own scars, their own battles. One evening, as I closed the shop, Mrs. Ellen handed me a small envelope. "It's from someone who wants to thank you," she said, with a knowing smile. Inside was a letter from a woman who had attended the book reading I organized weeks earlier. She wrote about how my words had touched her, how they had given her courage to face her own family struggles. Tears blurred my vision as I read. For the first time in a long time, I felt seen, truly seen by a stranger who understood the pain and the hope woven into my story. As the months passed, Lindsay and I rebuilt a new kind of relationship, one based on honesty, forgiveness, and mutual respect. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. I learned to let go of the idea that being a good mother meant sacrificing my own identity. I discovered that sometimes the greatest love we can give is the love we first give ourselves. One afternoon, Lindsay surprised me with a small framed photo. It was a picture she had taken secretly during one of our visits. Me smiling softly as I arranged books on a shelf. "I wanted you to have this," she said, her eyes shining, "because this is the mom I'm proud of." I held the photo close, feeling a warmth spread through me. It was more than a picture. It was a symbol of our journey from pain to healing. Looking back, I realized that the photo she once mocked wasn't a symbol of shame, but a catalyst for change. Sometimes the hardest moments lead us to the most profound transformations. And sometimes the people we think have hurt us the most are the ones we need to forgive first, including ourselves. The days after that framed photo arrived felt like walking into a new light, soft yet undeniable. I carried that moment with me like a small flame flickering steadily, refusing to be snuffed out. It wasn't just about Lindsay's gesture. It was about the fragile thread we were slowly weaving back between us. But healing, I learned, wasn't linear. It never moved in straight lines or clean chapters. Instead, it ebbed and flowed like the tide, sometimes pulling you forward, sometimes dragging you back. One morning, I woke up to the familiar ache in my chest, the kind that had lived with me for years disguised as fatigue, loneliness, or quiet regret. I sat up slowly, staring out the window at the gray sky, thinking about the past, about Lindsay, about the silence that had stretched between us for so long. I knew I had to confront one truth that I'd been avoiding. The wound wasn't just about the photo she'd posted or the words she'd said. It was about the years of neglect, the moments when I was invisible in my own home, the times when my love was met with indifference or anger. For decades, I had built my identity around being needed, around being indispensable. But what I hadn't realized was that need, when it's not reciprocated with respect or gratitude, can become a cage. That morning, I decided to write Lindsay a letter. Not to accuse, not to demand, but to express everything I'd held inside for so long. The loneliness, the exhaustion, the deep, aching love that never wavered even when it was ignored. Writing felt like lifting a weight off my chest. I poured out memories, the birthday cakes baked with trembling hands, the sleepless nights when she was sick, the sacrifices made silently so she could have more. I wrote about my fears of being forgotten, of fading away like a shadow. And I wrote about my hopes that one day she might see me, not just as mom, but as a woman with her own dreams, her own pain, and her own story. When I finished, I folded the letter carefully and placed it in an envelope. I wasn't sure if I would give it to her, but writing it was the first step toward reclaiming my voice. That afternoon, Lindsay called. "Mom, can we talk?" Her voice trembled with hesitation. We met at the park beneath the old oak tree where we used to spend lazy summer afternoons. The memories flooded back bittersweet and sharp. She reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. My letter. I read this last night, she said softly. And I'm so sorry I never really listened before. I thought I was strong by pushing you away, but I was just scared. Scared that if I let you in, I'd lose myself. Her confession hit me like a wave. We both had been so afraid, afraid to be vulnerable, to show weakness, to admit pain. We sat together on the bench, tears spilling freely now, unguarded and real. Mom, I want to try, she said. I want to rebuild what we lost. I nodded, feeling a mixture of hope and cautious optimism. The days that followed were filled with honest conversations, some painful, some healing. We talked about boundaries, about respect, about how to love each other without losing ourselves. One evening, Lindsay invited me over for dinner. It was simple pasta salad and a bottle of wine, but to me it was a feast of reconciliation. As we ate, she pulled out her phone and showed me a series of photos, moments from her life I had never seen before. Her first promotion, a birthday party with friends, quiet mornings with her cat. Sharing these glimpses of her world made me realize how much I had missed, how much distance we had created by silence. I want you to be part of this, she said, not just as my mom, but as someone I choose to have in my life. That night, I left her apartment feeling lighter than I had in years. Yet the healing journey was far from over. Old habits died hard. I found myself slipping back into the role of caretaker, eager to fix everything for Lindsay, forgetting that she needed to stand on her own feet. She reminded me gently, Mom, I'm not a child anymore. I need you to see me as your equal. It was a hard lesson, learning to love without losing myself in the process. Meanwhile, my job at the bookstore blossomed into something unexpected. I started writing a blog about family struggles, sharing stories from my own life and the lessons I'd learned. The response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from strangers who felt seen and understood. Women who had been hurt by their children, men who had lost touch with their parents, people who longed for forgiveness but didn't know how to ask for it. Through writing, I found a new purpose, a way to turn my pain into something meaningful. One afternoon, Mrs. Ellen surprised me again with a small gathering of regular customers celebrating my blog's first anniversary. Standing there surrounded by people who had become friends, I realized something profound. I was no longer defined by my past wounds, but by the strength it took to rise from them. That night, Lindsay and I talked late into the evening, sharing dreams for the future and plans to heal together. We're writing a new story, she said, her eyes shining with determination. Yes, I agreed, one where we both have a voice. And as the night deepened around us, I finally understood that love wasn't about perfection or sacrifice. It was about showing up messy, imperfect, and real. Together, we were finding our way home. The weeks after our tentative reunion with Lindsay felt like walking a tightrope. One misstep, and the fragile bridge between us could snap into irreparable pieces. Every day I found myself teetering between hope and caution, between daring to believe in her return and bracing myself for another betrayal. She was trying. I could see it in the small gestures, the way she answered my texts promptly, how she sometimes glanced at me with something softer in her eyes. But there were moments when the weight of years of resentment and misunderstanding hovered over her like a dark storm cloud ready to burst at any second. One afternoon, Lindsay invited me to her apartment for dinner. It was small, but cozy, filled with the warm glow of soft lamps and framed photos of places she'd traveled and friends she held dear. There was an unfamiliar sense of calm in that space, a reminder that the girl I'd raised had grown into a woman with her own life, her own story far beyond the walls of our broken past. We sat around her kitchen table, plates of homemade pasta steaming between us, the air thick with the unspoken. I wanted to break the silence, but words felt clumsy, heavy. Finally, she looked up, her eyes searching mine, vulnerable yet guarded. Mom, I want to understand, she said slowly. Why did you always push me so hard? Why couldn't you just let me be? Her question caught me off guard. I'd spent years rehearsing the answers in my head, justifications, excuses, reminders that I was preparing her for a harsh world. But hearing it like this, raw and honest, tore down every defense. I swallowed the lump in my throat, careful with my words, because I wanted you to have what I never had: stability, confidence, a chance to build a life without the struggles I faced. She nodded slowly, biting her lip. But sometimes it felt like you wanted to control me, like I was never enough, never good enough on my own. Her words stung sharply, like the prick of a thorn I hadn't realized was lodged deep. There was a hard truth in her accusation that I had long avoided. I had been too controlling, too demanding. I had mistaken my fears for care, my anxiety for love. We talked late into the night, the conversation unfolding like a fragile dance. She shared stories I had never heard, moments when she felt trapped by my expectations, when she hid her true self to avoid disappointing me. I admitted my own loneliness, the silent nights when I wondered if my sacrifices had been worth the cost. Despite the heaviness, the exchange ended without blame, just an aching mutual understanding that had been missing for years. The next morning, sunlight poured through my window as I sat nursing a cup of tea. Forgiveness, I realized, was not a singular moment, but a series of fragile, brave acts. And we were only beginning. But the path ahead was still uncertain. Just days later, I received a message from Marianne, my closest friend, since the day everything fell apart. Her text was brief but urgent. "Come over. We need to talk." When I arrived, her face was drawn serious, nothing like her usual warm, comforting presence. "Something's going on with Lindsay," she said, voice low. My heart tightened. Marianne explained that Lindsay had been spending time with people I didn't know, new friends more than acquaintances who seemed to pull her in directions I feared. Marianne's instincts told her these influences weren't good. "Do you think she's hiding things from you?" I asked, voice barely audible. Marianne nodded solemnly. "Maybe, but I think it's more than that. She's trying to find herself, and sometimes that means pushing away the past, even if it hurts those who love her." Her words echoed in my mind long after I left. Was Lindsay truly healing, or was she slipping away again, lost in a maze of new faces and fleeting freedoms? I resolved to ask her gently, to seek answers without pushing too hard. When we met again, I kept my voice soft. "Who are these new friends? What do they mean to you?" She hesitated, eyes flickering with something unreadable. "They're just people I connect with. They understand me in ways I didn't expect." "But do they understand where you come from? What we've been through?" She looked away, biting her lip. "Maybe not. Maybe I don't want to be tied down by where I come from." Her words felt like a punch to the gut. Was she trying to rewrite her story, erase the pain by running from it? Days blurred into weeks. Lindsay grew more distant, absorbed in a world I couldn't reach. One evening, feeling desperate, I decided to visit her unannounced. When I arrived, the door was ajar. Inside, a group of young people laughed and drank, filling the small apartment with a noisy, chaotic energy. Lindsay greeted me with a smile, but her eyes held a guarded edge. I stayed for a while, trying to find my place among strangers. The music thumped the air, thick with smoke and excitement. It was a world I barely recognized. Later, Lindsay pulled me aside. "Mom, I want you to meet someone." He was tall, dark-haired, with a cocky grin that unsettled me instantly. "Hi, I'm Jake," he said, extending a hand. I shook it, forcing a smile. He seemed charming, but something about his eyes, a restless flicker, a shadow lurking behind, made my skin crawl. As the night went on, I watched Lindsay relax, laugh more freely than I'd seen in months. But I also noticed Jake's hand lingering on her arm, the way his tone shifted from playful to possessive without warning. Later, I found a moment alone with one of Lindsay's friends, a quiet girl with glasses who watched everything with wary eyes. "Is Jake always like this?" I asked gently. She hesitated, then nodded. "He can be intense. Sometimes. Too much." Fear coiled tight inside me. Was Lindsay safe? Or was this new chapter just another storm waiting to break? I left that night heavy with dread and regret, haunted by memories of times I'd tried and failed to protect her. Sleepless, I lay awake, wrestling with guilt and hope. I realized that sometimes love means stepping back, letting go even when it terrifies you. The next morning, a message from Lindsay lit up my phone. "Can we talk?" "Please?" A flicker of hope warmed me. We met in the park where our healing began under the vast sky where past wounds felt smaller. She looked fragile eyes rimmed with exhaustion. "I'm sorry, Mom," she said, voice trembling. "Jake isn't who I thought he was. He's been controlling." I didn't know how to say no. My heart shattered for her, for the secret pain she'd carried alone. We sat on the bench holding on to each other, two broken women learning to piece themselves back together. In that moment, I understood. Our story wasn't finished. It never would be. But we were stronger now, not because we were perfect, but because we were trying. The road ahead would be long, marked by setbacks and breakthroughs, but we would walk it together. Because sometimes family isn't about never falling, it's about rising, again and again. The days slipped by, each one folding into the next with a rhythm both exhausting and oddly comforting. Lindsay's presence in my small apartment was a constant reminder of both the pain we'd endured and the fragile hope blooming between us. Watching her slowly reclaim her life was like witnessing a delicate flower pushing through cracked concrete, so fragile yet so determined. She started small, taking walks around the neighborhood, her eyes cautiously curious but wary. One afternoon, she found a nearby park bench and sat there for a long while, just breathing in the air, letting herself exist without fear. I remember watching her from the window, wanting to step outside and shield her from every possible harm, but knowing I had to let her face her own battles. The nights were the hardest. She would sometimes wake with a start, trembling as if the ghosts of her past were reaching out to pull her back into darkness. When that happened, I held her close, whispering words of comfort and strength until the tremors faded and her breathing slowed. In those moments, I felt both heartbroken and proud. Heartbroken because of the scars she carried, proud because of the courage she showed in facing them. Our conversations grew deeper, no longer surface-level pleasantries, but raw exchanges about pain, regrets, and hopes. She opened up about the manipulations Jake had used, how he twisted her confidence, isolating her from friends and family, planting doubts that made her question her worth. Hearing her story was like reliving my own worst fears, but this time I was determined to be her shield, her refuge. I also began to understand that my role as a mother was evolving. For so long, I had been the fixer, the protector, the one who sacrificed her own needs for the family's sake. But now I was learning to listen without trying to solve everything, to hold space for Lindsay's pain without trying to erase it. That shift was humbling and necessary. One afternoon, while helping Lindsay sort through a box of old photos she'd brought from her apartment, I stumbled upon pictures of her younger self, smiling, carefree, full of dreams. It struck me how far she'd fallen, and yet how much strength she carried beneath the surface. "You've always been brave," I told her softly. She looked up, tears glistening in her eyes. "I forgot how to be. No more," I promised. "We'll find that bravery again." Amid this slow healing, I found myself reconnecting with parts of my own life I'd long neglected. My job at the bookstore became more than a source of income. It was a lifeline. Among the quiet rows of books and the comforting rustle of pages, I discovered a renewed sense of purpose. The owner, Marjorie, was a woman of kindness and quiet strength who treated me like more than an employee. She saw me as a person with a story worth hearing. One day, Marjorie caught me staring out the window, lost in thought. "You've got that look," she said, raising an eyebrow. "What's on your mind?" The first time Lindsay truly smiled again felt like a small miracle. It wasn't forced or hesitant. It was real, the kind of smile that springs from deep within when your soul feels lighter for a moment and your heart dares to hope. We were in the kitchen brewing tea together. The light through the window painted golden streaks across the counters, and for once, the silence between us wasn't heavy or awkward. It was comfortable, safe. "Mom," Lindsay said quietly, stirring her cup, "I'm sorry for everything, for how I treated you, for shutting you out." Her voice cracked just a little, and my throat tightened. All the anger, hurt, and bitterness I'd held at bay rushed up like a tide, but I swallowed it down, nodding slowly. "I know," I whispered, "and I'm sorry too, for not understanding you sooner." It was one of those rare moments where forgiveness wasn't just spoken, it was felt. the kind of fragile truce born from shared pain and the desire to heal. From then on, the walls between us began to crumble. Lindsay started coming to me for advice, not just about her struggles with Jake and the divorce, but about everything: her job, her friends, even her fears about the future. And I listened without judgment, without pushing. Just listening. But healing was not linear. There were days when the past haunted us like ghosts. Old arguments echoed in the silence. Lingering resentments bubbled beneath the surface, threatening to undo all the progress. Lindsay would sometimes shut down, retreating behind walls I couldn't break through. Those moments were the hardest, when love felt fragile and distant, when hope wavered. But I reminded myself, real healing takes time, and sometimes it takes falling apart before you can come back together. One afternoon, Lindsay confided a secret she'd kept hidden: the true extent of Jake's manipulation. How he'd twisted her self-worth until she didn't recognize herself anymore. How he isolated her from friends and family so completely she felt trapped, like a bird in a gilded cage. Her voice trembled as she spoke, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I didn't know who I was anymore," she said. "I was so scared and alone." I held her tightly, feeling my own heart break for the daughter I barely recognized. But there was also fierce pride in her bravery to speak out, to reclaim her voice. "I'm here," I told her. "And I'm not going anywhere." That night, we made a pact to face the future together, no matter how uncertain. To rebuild trust step by step. To hold on to hope. In the weeks that followed, Lindsay found new strength. She reconnected with old friends, started therapy, and even enrolled in a yoga class to help with her anxiety. It wasn't perfect, and there were setbacks, but she was moving forward. I also began to see changes in myself. My anger towards Lindsay softened, replaced by compassion and understanding. The identity I'd lost for so long, not just as a mother but as a woman, began to resurface. I rediscovered passions I'd buried beneath years of sacrifice. Writing, painting, even volunteering at the local library. One evening, as we sat on the patio watching the sunset, Lindsay turned to me with a quiet smile. "Thank you," she said, "for not giving up on me." I squeezed her hand, tears in my eyes. "Never." But as much as we'd grown closer, the scars of the past still lingered, reminding us that healing was an ongoing journey. One day, a package arrived, a letter from Jake. It was brief, cold, and unapologetic, blaming Lindsay for their failures and demanding she forget about me and move on. Reading his words, I felt a surge of protectiveness and rage. But Lindsay looked at me, calm and resolute. "He doesn't get to define me anymore," she said firmly. "I'm done with his lies." Her strength inspired me. We decided to block Jake from our lives, cutting ties with the toxicity that had poisoned our family. That decision marked a turning point, a declaration that our future would be shaped by love, not pain. As the months passed, our bond deepened. Lindsay moved back into her apartment, but we saw each other often, sharing meals, laughter, and tears. We created new memories, slowly rewriting the story of our family. One day, Lindsay surprised me with a framed photo of us taken during one of our rare, happy moments. On the back, she'd written, "Together we are stronger." I kept it on my bedside table, a daily reminder that despite everything, love could endure. And I learned something powerful. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past. It frees you to embrace the future. Because family isn't perfect. It's messy, complicated, and sometimes painful. But it's also where we find our greatest strength. As I close this chapter, I feel a quiet peace, not because everything is perfect, but because we chose love over bitterness, healing over hate. And that, to me, is the truest kind of victory. Even though Lindsay and I had begun to rebuild, the wounds left by her betrayal weren't invisible scars, they were deep. Sometimes aching reminders that trust once broken takes a lifetime to mend. There were mornings I woke with a heaviness I couldn't shake, an echo of all the years I'd spent trying to be the perfect mother, only to be publicly mocked and dismissed by my own daughter. But the coffee we shared on Marianne's patio every morning grounded me. Marianne never pressured me to explain or fix anything. She just sat quietly, passing the steaming mug to me with a knowing smile, as if to say, "You're allowed to feel this." The truth was, I was learning a new kind of patience, not just with Lindsay, but with myself. For the first time in decades, I realized I'd spent more time molding myself to fit others' expectations than discovering who I truly was beneath it all. That realization was both terrifying and liberating. I remember one afternoon sitting alone in the little bookstore where I'd recently started working. I was rearranging a shelf of memoirs, stories of pain, redemption, and unexpected forgiveness when a customer approached me. "You have a kind face," she said softly. "Like you've been through something hard but are still standing." Her words hit me like a wave. I smiled, and for the first time in a long time, I believed it. Maybe I wasn't just the woman my daughter chose to publicly humiliate. Maybe I was someone who could still rise. But with that rising came moments of doubt. I'd scroll through social media late at night, the glow of Lindsay's posts illuminating the room. Brunches with friends, vacations. I wasn't invited to celebrations where my name was never mentioned. I wanted to reach out to tell her I loved her despite it all. But the fear of more rejection held me back. One night, the silence was shattered by a sharp ping on my phone. A message from Lindsay. "I saw your post today. I didn't know you felt that way." "I'm sorry, Mom." It was brief, vulnerable, the first crack in the wall she'd built around us. We started talking more cautiously. The conversations were uneven at first. Awkward apologies, tentative questions, careful listening. But every message chipped away at the distance. Then came the card. That simple piece of paper, no return address, just her handwriting folded neatly inside. "You were right about the post. I'm sorry. I didn't think. I was showing off. I was stupid." Holding that note, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, sorrow, hope. No promises, no demands. Just acknowledgement. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I tucked the note into a box with old family photos, framed smiles, faded memories, moments that once seemed permanent, but were now fragile relics. Sometimes forgiveness isn't a grand gesture. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's choosing to believe in the possibility of repair without forgetting the pain. In the days that followed, I found myself waking earlier, sipping my coffee, while the house was still dark. I journaled about grief, about letting go, about what it meant to redefine love. One morning, Marianne noticed the change. "You're glowing," she said, handing me a fresh cup. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." I smiled, feeling the warmth spread beyond the steam of the coffee. I was learning to be whole again, not because Lindsay apologized or because the past changed, but because I chose to reclaim my story. And that, I realized, was the most powerful form of revenge, living fully authentically beyond the reach of hurt. Because in the end, the story isn't about betrayal. It's about resilience. It's about finding yourself when everything you thought you knew falls apart. And it's about building something new from the ashes. I hesitated, but then shared a little of my journey, how I was trying to rebuild not just my daughter's life, but my own. She listened without interruption and then offered a smile. "Sometimes the hardest part is just starting, but you've already done that." Her words stayed with me, a reminder that healing was a process, not a destination. And then there was Marianne, the quiet, steadfast friend who never pushed, but always offered a comforting presence. Her morning coffees and gentle conversations were a balm to my bruised spirit. With her, I could simply be without pretense or expectation. Through all this, I realized that healing wasn't about forgetting or pretending the past didn't hurt. It was about acknowledging the pain, facing it head on, and choosing to move forward anyway. Lindsay's journey was my journey, and in some ways, my own rebirth. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with unknown challenges and fears. But as I watched Lindsay sleep peacefully one night, I felt a fierce hope rising within me. Hope that we could build something new from the ruins, something stronger and truer than before. Because sometimes the greatest acts of love aren't grand gestures or heroic saves. They're the quiet moments, holding a hand, sharing a cup of coffee, saying, "I'm here." And in those moments, I knew we were both healing one fragile step at a time. Some nights after Marianne had gone to bed, I would sit by the window in my small apartment and stare out at the quiet street. The streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement, and I found comfort in their steady, unwavering glow. It reminded me that even when everything feels uncertain and fractured, some things remain constant. I thought about my own journey, how far I'd come from the woman who once lived for approval for the smiles and nods of her children, and how hard it was to finally stand alone. I realized I had spent so many years bending myself out of shape, contorting into the shape of a mother who was always available, always patient, always understanding, even when I felt broken inside. I'd ignored my own exhaustion, my own tears, because I believed that's what love required. But now I knew better. Love wasn't about losing yourself. It was about finding strength even when you were cracked and bruised. One afternoon, while shelving a new delivery of books, I came across a title that caught my eye: The Art of Letting Go. The author spoke about the painful but necessary process of releasing people and expectations that no longer served us. I bought the book with my first paycheck and read it cover to cover that very weekend. The words felt like a balm on my soul, permission to grieve without guilt, to rebuild without shame. There was a passage that struck me deeply. Sometimes the hardest person to forgive is the one who doesn't even realize they hurt you. And sometimes the hardest forgiveness is the one you grant yourself. I closed the book and thought about Lindsay. I thought about how her public cruelty, the post, the mockery, had cut me deeply. But more than that, I thought about how much she must be hurting hidden behind that bravado and careless laughter. Maybe she was still a child in many ways, still learning how to love imperfectly. That evening, I pulled out my phone and typed a message to her, hesitant but hopeful. "I'm here when you're ready." It wasn't a demand. It wasn't an expectation. Just a simple truth. Days passed and there was no immediate response. Part of me was disappointed, but another part knew healing wasn't a race. It was a slow dance, sometimes 2 steps forward and 1 step back. In that silence, I turned to other parts of my life. I joined a community group at the local library, people who met weekly to share stories, to listen, and to support each other. It was humbling to realize that so many carried invisible burdens, that I was not alone in feeling forgotten or undervalued. One woman, a retired teacher named Gloria, became a dear friend. She told me, "You're stronger than you think, dear. Sometimes the hardest battles are fought in silence." Her words echoed in my mind long after we said goodbye. Slowly, I found joy in small things: a walk in the park, the scent of blooming jasmine outside my window, the sound of rain against the roof. These moments stitched me back together, piece by fragile piece. And then, out of the blue, Lindsay reached out again. "Can we talk?" That message set my heart racing. I knew the road ahead would be complicated, fraught with old wounds and new fears. But it was a start, a chance. Because sometimes the most profound courage is found in simply opening the door and stepping through it, even when you're scared of what might be waiting on the other side. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past, but also the lightness of possibility. "Yes," I replied. "Let's talk." And for the first time in a long time, I felt the fragile stirrings of hope. After that first meeting at the cafe, I found myself replaying our conversation again and again. The way Lindsay's voice had softened when she said, "I didn't realize how much it hurt you." Those words struck a chord I hadn't known was still raw beneath all my healing. It was like the wound was exposed once more, but this time I could touch it with gentleness instead of fear. I began to see Lindsay not as the daughter who had betrayed me, but as a person struggling with her own shadows. The daughter who had built walls to protect herself but didn't realize those walls kept me out. It made me think about the years I had spent trying to be the perfect mom. How much of that perfection was about control? Controlling my role, controlling her love, controlling the narrative of our family. And when it slipped through my fingers, I'd clung tighter, not realizing I was pushing her further away. We had so much to unpack, so many layers of misunderstandings that had piled up over the years like dust on a forgotten shelf. I told her about the nights I stayed awake worrying if she felt loved, if she was happy, if I had done enough. And she told me about her own loneliness, the pressure to succeed, and the fear that she would never be enough for anyone, least of all her mother. One afternoon, Lindsay called me unexpectedly. "Mom, do you want to come over for dinner?" she asked hesitantly. My heart leapt. It was a small invitation, but to me, it was monumental. That evening, sitting in her apartment watching her nervously prepare food, I realized how much we'd both grown. The woman before me wasn't the arrogant, distant daughter I'd imagined. She was vulnerable, seeking connection, and scared to fully trust. Over pasta and wine, we talked about everything: our fears, our regrets, our hopes. And for the first time, I felt like we were truly seeing each other again. But even as we laughed and shared, a quiet tension lingered beneath the surface, the knowledge that the hurt was still there, like a scar beneath the skin. Forgiveness wasn't instant. It was a process, a dance of patience and vulnerability. In the following weeks, we continued to rebuild step by step. Some days were easier than others. Sometimes a careless word or a forgotten call would reopen the ache. But with each stumble, we grew stronger. I learned to let go of my need to control, to accept Lindsay for who she was: flawed, complicated, but still my daughter. And Lindsay learned to lower her defenses, to allow herself to be seen and loved, even in her imperfection. We began to create new memories, simple, ordinary moments that held extraordinary meaning. Coffee dates, shared books, quiet walks in the park. These moments didn't erase the past, but they wove a new fabric for our relationship, one built on honesty, acceptance, and love. One evening, as I was leaving her apartment, Lindsay hugged me tightly and whispered, "Thank you, Mom, for not giving up." I held her close and whispered back, "Thank you for letting me back in." That night, I lay awake thinking about the journey we'd taken from betrayal and bitterness to understanding and hope. It wasn't the story I had imagined for us, but it was real. And real was enough. Because sometimes love isn't about perfection or grand gestures. It's about showing up even when it's hard. About forgiveness even when the pain is fresh. About choosing hope when the past threatens to pull you under. And in that choice, we found freedom. As days turned into weeks, the fragile bridge we were building between Lindsay and me began to solidify, but not without its share of tremors. Some mornings I woke up with hope blooming in my chest, ready to face the world anew. Other times, doubt crept in like a cold shadow, whispering that the wounds were too deep, the distance too wide to ever truly close. One afternoon, as I was making tea, Lindsay sat down beside me with a hesitant smile. She pulled out an old photo album, the kind with thick yellowed pages and fading pictures taped inside. "I found this in Mom's stuff," she said softly, flipping through images of us from years ago: birthday parties, family vacations, lazy Sunday mornings. I watched her eyes soften as she traced her finger over a picture of me holding her when she was a baby. My smile radiant despite tired eyes. "You were so young," she murmured. "I never thought about how much you gave up for me." Tears welled up unexpectedly, blurring my vision. "I gave up a lot," I admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "But I never regretted a single second." It was one of those rare moments when our defenses slipped away, revealing the raw truth beneath. Lindsay reached over and took my hand, a simple gesture, but one that carried the weight of years of unspoken love and pain. In the days that followed, I noticed subtle changes in her: less defensiveness, more vulnerability. She started inviting me to her yoga classes, sharing her favorite music, even letting me into conversations with her closest friends. It was as if the walls between us were crumbling brick by brick, replaced by a delicate yet resilient new foundation. But healing, I learned, isn't a straight path. One evening, after a particularly difficult day at work, Lindsay stormed into my room, frustration boiling over. "Why do you always try to control everything?" she snapped. "Why can't you just let me live my life?" I wanted to react, to defend myself, to prove my intentions were good. But instead I took a deep breath and said, "Because I'm scared. Scared of losing you. Scared that if I let go, we'll drift apart forever." Her eyes softened again, the anger melting into something tender. "I'm scared too," she confessed. "Scared that I'm not enough. Scared that you'll never really forgive me." We held each other then, two broken souls finding solace in shared fears. That night, as silence wrapped around our small home, I realized forgiveness wasn't just about her. It was about freeing myself from the chains of resentment I had been carrying for too long. It was about choosing love even when it hurt. Choosing hope even when the future seemed uncertain. Slowly, the bitterness that had once consumed me began to fade, replaced by a cautious optimism. One afternoon, Lindsay surprised me with a small gift, a framed picture of us from years ago, the one where I'm bent over mopping the floor. But this time, the photo was accompanied by a note. "Thank you for everything, Mom. For your strength, your love, even when I didn't see it. I'm sorry for making you feel small." I held the frame close, feeling the weight of those words settle into my heart. That simple act, her acknowledgement, was more powerful than any apology, any promise. It was a bridge. A promise that we were rebuilding something real. That love, no matter how fractured, could still find its way. As the sun set beyond the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink, I felt a quiet peace settle inside me. The road ahead was still long, still uncertain, but for the first time in years, I wasn't walking it alone. And maybe that was enough. The air was thick with silence, but it felt lighter now, like the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean by rain. I sat on the porch, my hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea, watching the sun dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the garden I'd tended all these years. It felt different this evening, softer somehow, like the weight on my chest had finally begun to lift. I thought about Lindsay, about how far we'd come yet, how far we still had to go. The silence between us wasn't empty anymore. It was full of something tentative hope. I realized that sometimes love isn't about grand gestures or sweeping reconciliations. Sometimes it's about the quiet moments. A shared glance, a tentative apology, a note left on the kitchen table. The small things that stitch broken hearts back together. For so long I had defined myself by being Mom, the constant, the provider, the fixer. But in losing Lindsay's approval, I had found something far more precious. Myself. I was whole again. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I felt seen. Not just by her, but by myself. That night, Lindsay knocked gently on my door. I opened it to find her standing there, eyes glistening with unshed tears, holding a small box. "I made something for you," she said softly. Inside the box was a scrapbook, pages filled with photographs, notes, even little drawings from when she was a child. But more than that, it was a chronicle of our journey, the painful moments, the misunderstandings, and the slow steps toward healing. We sat together, flipping through the pages. Words weren't always necessary. The tears we shared spoke louder than anything. I hugged her tightly, feeling the warmth and fragility of our renewed bond. "Thank you," I whispered. "For what?" she asked. "For never giving up on me," I replied. And in that moment, I knew we were no longer mother and daughter, bound by obligation or expectation. We were two women learning to love each other anew, imperfectly, but genuinely. The days that followed were not without challenges, but each one was easier than the last, because we faced them together. I returned to my part-time job at the bookstore with a lighter heart, finding joy in the simple rhythm of everyday life. Lindsay invited me to more family gatherings, and I even started attending some of her yoga classes, discovering a newfound sense of peace in movement. I often thought back to that picture she had posted, me bent over mopping the floor, the moment that had sparked so much pain. But now I saw it differently. It was not a symbol of shame, but of strength. Of a mother's unwavering love, her sacrifices hidden in the quiet corners of life. The road to forgiveness and reconciliation had been long and winding, filled with heartbreak and hope. But I learned that sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply to let go of resentment of past wounds, and even of the need to be understood fully. Because in the end, love is not about perfection. It's about choosing to stay, to forgive, and to rebuild, even when the future is uncertain. If you're watching this, maybe you're carrying your own wounds. Maybe you feel unseen or unloved by someone you thought would always be there. I want you to know this. You are not alone. Healing is possible. It begins with one small step, whether it's an apology, a conversation, or simply choosing to see yourself through kinder eyes. Thank you for listening to my story. If it touched you, if it gave you hope, or made you feel less alone, please share it with someone who might need it too. And if you want to hear more stories of resilience, betrayal, and quiet strength, subscribe to Grace's truth. Remember, sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply living well and loving yourself fiercely.